Folks around these parts say the deeper the snow gets in northern Minnesota, the closer the forest presses in on you, gets trying to swallow you whole. My name's Carl. I'm 62. Used to be a ranger for the DNR, and I've spent more nights under pine boughs than I have under my own roof. Ever since my wife passed, my life's become a loop of quiet days, fixing snowmobile trails, hauling firewood, and checking in on neighbors who live even farther off the map than I do. People assume you grow fearless when you live alone in the woods, but solitude just sharpens the sounds that come creeping through the trees. That February night, it was close to midnight when I decided to snowshoe out to check my old trap line for wolf tracks, mostly to keep from feeling the cabin's silence pressing on my chest. The moon was so bright, it painted the drifts in pale blue light, and the sky looked clean enough to shatter. I remember my breath hanging thick and silver in the air, turning my mustache to ice. I'd gone maybe half a mile from my porch when something started to feel wrong. It wasn't the cold that got to me. It was how still everything suddenly was, like the whole forest was waiting for me to make the next move. I've always trusted the night, because out here, you learn to know what's normal and what ain't. But as I trudged deeper, I began hearing this low, wavering cry floating through the pines, almost like a woman sobbing far off, but mixed with a scratching noise that scraped across my spine. It moved when I moved, slipping around me as though keeping just out of sight. And every time I paused, it paused too. I tried to tell myself it was a branch creaking under ice, but I'd been in these woods too long to believe that lie. My snowshoes creaked with every step, making me feel exposed, like some animal being stalked. The moonlight flickered as clouds rolled past, shadows dragging across the snow like long fingers. I smelled something sharp and musky in the air, not quite animal and not quite earth, and it set my nerves on edge. My heartbeat thumped so hard I could feel it in my temples. I pulled my scarf higher over my face, half to block the cold, and half because I felt like something might be watching from the dark. I can't say why I didn't turn back right then, but curiosity has a way of pushing a man farther than he should go. A little ways on, I came into a clearing where the snow lay untouched and smooth as a sheet. That's when I saw it. A shape at the far edge of the trees, tall, pale and motionless, with what looked like two glinting eyes reflecting the moon. My chest squeezed up so tight I couldn't breathe. For a moment I was sure I was looking at the Wendigo the Ojibwe talk about, some starving spirit that prowls the winter woods. The thing was standing too upright for a bear, too big for a man, and the silence between us felt heavier than the cold. I tried to lift my walking stick like a weapon, but my arms felt full of ice. Snow sifted down off the pine boughs, drifting around that shape like a curtain. It didn't move, didn't even blink, and my legs felt rooted in the crusty snow. I tried to whisper a prayer, though my lips barely worked. I remember feeling a sort of buzzing in my skull, as though the woods themselves were humming. For the first time in years, I felt small, like a boy again, afraid of monsters hiding beyond the firelight. Slowly, I forced myself closer, step by dragging step, until I realized the truth. It was just a massive, snowy owl, perched on a drift-covered stump, wings half unfurled like a shroud. Relief washed over me so strong, I almost laughed out loud, though my voice sounded cracked as old wood. The owl turned its head all the way around, staring right through me with those brilliant eyes. But as I turned to look back down my trail, the owl burst into flight without a sound, vanishing into the trees so fast it might have been smoke. That's when I noticed fresh tracks cutting away through the clearing. Only they weren't bird tracks, nor wolf, nor deer. They were long, deep imprints that looked eerily like hands pressed into the snow, fingers spread wide. A sudden breeze kicked up a swirl of snow dust, and the wailing sound started again, but this time from behind me, closer than before. I could feel it circling me, though I couldn't see a thing moving between the pines. Now I know the mind can play tricks on a man, especially when he's alone, and the cold starts creeping into his bones. I keep telling myself it was probably a lynx stalking me, curious and silent, or maybe just the shifting ice groaning in the night. But even as I sit here writing this by lantern light, part of me can't shake the feeling that something else was out there that night, something watching, clever enough to hide in the spaces between the trees. Sometimes I dream about that clearing, and I wake up convinced I'll find those hand-shaped tracks outside my door. And this is just the beginning. What comes next still keeps me awake at night. Back in 1998, when I was still working the overnight shift at the paper mill in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, I used to drive home on County Road 66, a lonely stretch bordered by black spruce and frozen marshes. My name's Denise, and I was 35 then, raising 2 boys on my own after my husband took off south. Nights were my quiet time. The only hours I felt the world slow down enough to catch my breath. I'd keep the radio low and the heat blasting, my thermos of coffee wedged between my knees. Folks always told me to stick to the main highway, but the back roads saved me 15 minutes, and I liked the feeling of having the world to myself. That winter was bitter cold. One of those years the frost crept across your windshield like cracked porcelain. It was well past 2 in the morning when this happened. Snow was falling light as flour, swirling in my headlights, making the forest look alive. I remember thinking how pretty it was, right before everything went sideways. I'd just passed a bend, where the tamaracks close in like a tunnel, when my high beams swept across something tall and pale, standing beside the road. It was so sudden I nearly jerked the wheel into the ditch. At first I thought it was a man in a long coat, but the shape was too big. The shoulders sloped like an animal's. My heart slammed into my ribs so hard I felt it in my teeth. The thing didn't move, just stood there with its head tilted a little, as if curious. Its eyes reflected bright yellow in the light, like twin coins held up to the moon. I slowed nearly to a stop, gripping the wheel so tight my fingers went numb. I was shaking all over, the heat blasting my face while my back broke out in cold sweat. The snow seemed to hush the world, like I'd driven into a place where sound couldn't follow. I cracked the window an inch and listened, hearing nothing but the hush of flakes landing on metal. That's when I caught a smell, sharp and bitter, like wet fur mixed with pine pitch. It rolled into the car and made me gag. The creature shifted its weight, and I realized it was standing on 4 legs, though its front half was taller than any timber wolf I'd ever seen. Its fur was pale gray, almost silver, with long wiry strands that shivered in the wind. For a split second, the thought of a werewolf shot through my mind. Even though I've never been one for ghost stories, my breath fogged up the windshield again, and I wiped it clear with my sleeve, desperate to keep eyes on it. My pulse throbbed in my temples, drowning out the radio's soft hum. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt that level of raw fear. Every instinct in me was yelling to leave. Then, without warning, it dropped to all 4s completely and slunk into the trees, so smooth and silent it was like it melted into the darkness. I sat there, engine idling, staring at the spot where it disappeared, hoping to see eyes flash back at me. But the woods swallowed it whole. I finally forced myself to drive on, feeling my tires slip a little on the icy road. About 50 yards ahead, I spotted huge paw prints crossing the snowbank and cutting through the ditch, each print bigger than my hand. They led into the marsh where the cattails stood black and brittle against the drifts. Part of me wanted to get out and look closer, but the smarter part kept me locked behind the wheel. I told myself it was just an unusually big wolf, but the way it moved didn't sit right with me. And that smell, nothing in these woods smells like that. Now, I've seen wolves plenty of times, and even the big ones never gave me chills the way that thing did. I still take the highway home these days, no matter how empty my wallet is for gas. People can call me jumpy all they want, but there's something out there that ain't right, and I'm in no hurry to meet it again. Anyway, let's go to the next one. It was late summer here in northern Minnesota, the kind of August night where the mosquitoes swarm your ears and the sky stays pink until nearly 10. My name's Todd, 54 years old, and I've worked the same warden job around Lake of the Woods for over 30 years. My kids are grown and gone, and these days it's mostly just me and my boat, patrolling the islands and checking anglers for licenses. Folks always assume being a warden's exciting, but it's long stretches of quiet punctuated by flashes of pure adrenaline. I've grown used to odd sights, floating logs mistaken for lake monsters, or loons screaming like banshees in the dark. But that night felt different, right from the start. The air was heavy and smelled of wet moss. I'd just tied off my boat near a little cove that locals call Pine Needle Bay. The water lay so still it reflected the stars like a mirror. I wanted to check a campsite folks said was trashed by a bear. I didn't expect to find myself questioning what was real. As I followed the trail away from the shore, my flashlight beam danced over ferns and tangled roots, throwing my shadow high on the pines. I kept hearing soft rustling ahead, but it always stopped the second I held my breath to listen closer. A barred owl hooted far off, making my scalp prickle. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a porcupine rooting around. But then came a low, throaty growl, not the snarl of a black bear, but something deeper, almost like a man trying to speak underwater. It echoed through the trees, vibrating in my chest. I froze, shining my light around, half expecting to see yellow eyes staring back. The forest felt like it was leaning in on me, every leaf hanging still. Even the mosquitoes seemed to vanish. The smell of damp earth grew sharper, mixed with something coppery I couldn't place. My breath felt thick, catching in my throat as I stood there, caught between curiosity and fear. I edged forward, stepping as quietly as I could, though the pine needles crackled under my boots. The growl rose again, closer this time, and I thought I saw a hulking shape slip behind a cedar. For a moment I was certain it was a bear on 2 legs, towering high enough to brush the lower branches. My stomach dropped, and a memory flashed through my mind. Stories I'd heard as a kid about Old Stony, some half-man, half-beast that stalked the islands. I've never believed that kind of talk, but in that instant, every hair on my neck was standing straight up. My fingers tightened around the grip of my maglite until my knuckles hurt. The shadows shifted as clouds rolled over the stars, plunging the trail into deeper blackness. I tried calling out, my voice sounding too small in the dark, but whatever it was didn't answer. Instead, it moved sideways, circling me unseen. I decided to step into a gap between 2 trees where the undergrowth opened up. That's when I finally caught a clear look. A massive moose, its antlers wide as a truck's bumper, half hidden behind a birch. The odd thing was, it wasn't moving like a normal moose. It kept swaying its head, stomping one foot, and letting out a groan that didn't sound right. Its eyes reflected red in my flashlight beam, and I could swear they looked almost human for a split second. My relief was sharp, but incomplete, because moose usually bolt away when they see people. Yet this one seemed to watch me, sizing me up like a predator. Then it swung around and disappeared into the brush, silent as mist. I crept forward and found the brush flattened where it had stood. The soil churned like something big had been pacing in circles. My nerves were rattled, but I forced myself to back out and head for the boat. I keep telling myself it was just a bull moose in rut, acting aggressive, but I've seen enough moose to know they don't groan like that, nor do their eyes look the way those did. Sometimes, when I'm out on the lake alone at night, I think I hear that same growl drifting across the water, and I find myself gripping the throttle a little tighter. The next one will send chills down your spine. People in these parts believe the northern lights don't just dance for beauty. They're spirits moving through the sky, keeping watch over the forests below. My name's Laura. I'm 48, and I run a small bait shop along the Rainy River near International Falls, Minnesota. Since my husband passed, it's been me and my dog, Murphy, keeping the shop open and trying to keep loneliness out of the corners of the house. Winters here are long, the kind that make wood crack in the stove and your breath freeze in midair. But sometimes the sky comes alive in swirling greens and purples, and I swear the whole world feels closer to something ancient. One night in early January, business was slow, and I decided to take Murphy out for a late walk under the auroras. I bundled up in 3 layers, clipped a flashlight to my parka, and headed toward the narrow trail that winds behind my shop. I never thought a simple walk would leave me questioning what's real and what my mind wants to believe. The snow was packed, hard underfoot, and every step echoed like breaking bones in the hush. Murphy trotted ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging, leaving a single line of paw prints that shone under the shifting lights overhead. The sky rippled like silk, casting shadows that moved even when the trees stood still. About half a mile in, I noticed Murphy had stopped dead, ears pricked, staring into a thicket of birches. A sound drifted out, a soft chuffing, wet and rhythmic, like something breathing through water. I clicked off my flashlight to listen better, which I immediately regretted, because the dark swallowed me so fast it felt like stepping under water. The cold nipped at my cheeks, and my breath puffed out in quick, nervous clouds. Somewhere to my left, a branch cracked under something heavy, and the air suddenly smelled musky and sour. My stomach clenched, and I reached for Murphy's collar, but he wouldn't budge. I could just barely make out a shape moving between the trees, taller than a man, swaying side to side as it stepped forward. The northern lights pulsed green and pink across its silhouette, highlighting a long, narrow muzzle and thick shoulders. My mind screamed bear, but then it stood upright for several seconds, towering far higher than any black bear I'd ever seen, moving in a way that made my skin crawl. Its eyes caught the lights and reflected pale blue, like twin chips of ice. I felt every hair on my body lift, and my legs turned watery beneath me. Murphy whimpered low in his throat, a sound I'd never heard from him before. I thought about turning and running, but something inside me wanted to know what it was, even though common sense was screaming otherwise. I strained my eyes, desperate for some normal explanation, but it kept swaying in that eerie rhythm. My ears were full of my own pulse, thudding like a hammer. I forced myself to whisper, "Hey there," my voice trembling like the wind in dry leaves. The creature lowered back onto 4 legs, and I realized in a rush of relief that it was a huge moose, its antlers half lost in velvet, shaking snow off its back. But before I could feel fully safe, it let out a sound I've never heard from a moose. A wet, bubbling moan, almost like a person crying underwater. Then it backed away, stepping silently between the birches, its bulk disappearing like fog in moonlight. Murphy finally found his courage and barked once, but I hushed him quick, feeling the air shift cold around us. I flicked my flashlight back on and scanned the snow, finding enormous tracks leading off into the dark, deeper than any moose should leave. Each print looked oddly splayed, toes spread wider than normal, and in some places there were streaks like fingers had dragged through the snow. My skin prickled with dread. and I swallowed hard, trying not to imagine hands instead of hooves. Now folks can call me superstitious, but I've lived my whole life here, and I've never seen a moose behave like that, nor leave tracks shaped like fingers. I tell myself it was just a big animal, spooked by the lights. But part of me wonders if the old stories about spirits walking beneath the aurora aren't just tales after all. Sometimes, when the lights ripple overhead, I half expect to see that shape standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. Anyway, let's go to the next one. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I went to check the fence behind the barn, or so I thought, here on the outskirts of Ely, Minnesota, where the forest presses so close you can hear the wind breathing through the pine needles like a sleeping animal. My name's Ben, 61, widower, and I've run a small herd of Highland cattle for the past 15 years, trying to keep my mind busy and my bones warm. I'm not one for tall tales, but living alone out here gives you a lot of silence to fill, and sometimes that silence fills itself. That night in October, the sky was a spill of stars, clear and cold enough to make my teeth ache when I breathed. The cows had been restless all day, bunching up at the far end of the pasture, snorting at shadows. I figured a wolf might have been prowling nearby. I carried my old lantern, its glass chipped, the flame flickering in the breeze as I trudged along the fence line. Nothing about that evening felt particularly strange, till it did. I'd made it halfway down the fence when I heard a low humming sound, soft at first, rising and falling like someone singing a lullaby through clenched teeth. It seemed to seep from the trees themselves, vibrating in the air and through my chest. I stopped, swinging my lantern side to side, trying to spot the eyeshine of a predator. The cows were silent now, heads up, ears pointed toward the forest. The smell hit me next, a sharp, wet moss scent, mixed with something sour like old milk turned bad. My scalp tightened, and I pulled my coat closer, suddenly wishing I'd stayed inside by the stove. The trees looked darker than usual, shadows shifting in ways that made my stomach knot. I told myself it was just wind or an owl calling in some strange tone, but I've heard owls all my life, and this wasn't that. The lantern's flame danced wildly, making the fence posts throw long, twitching shadows. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw a shape move between two spruce trunks. It was low to the ground at first, creeping forward on 4 legs, but then it lifted its front half off the snow, rising higher than any animal I'd ever seen here. For a heartbeat, I thought it was a man covered in fur, the way its shoulders rolled and its arms hung down almost to its knees. The lantern light caught eyes that glowed a dull amber, blinking slowly as if considering me. My throat went dry. I felt my heartbeat in my tongue. I tried to call out, but no words came. Instead, I gripped the fence wire so hard I could feel the barbs cutting into my glove. The creature tilted its head, and I swear it gave off another burst of that humming sound, this time lower, almost mournful. My breath fogged the cold air, and it smelled even stronger of wet fur and rot. I wanted to run, but my boots felt nailed to the ground. I took one step closer, squinting through the lantern light, desperate to see it for what it really was. That's when the creature dropped back down and slunk forward into the open. And there it was, just a massive cougar, muscles rippling under its tawny coat, eyes catching the lantern glow. My chest loosened in relief, though my knees still shook. But before I could let out a laugh, the cougar turned its head sharply toward the trees, ears flattened, as if it heard something I couldn't. Then it vanished in a single leap, melting into the darkness so fast it was as if it had never been there. When I swept my lantern around, the humming had stopped, but the shadows seemed thicker, pulsing slightly, like breath. I bent down to examine the snow and found paw prints, but right beside them were odd marks, long grooves dragging through the snow as if fingers had clawed the ground. The hair rose along my arms despite the cold. Now I've seen cougars before, and none of them ever stood up like that or made sounds that rattled my ribs. Maybe it was the lantern light playing tricks on me, or the wind carrying strange echoes. But sometimes, when I'm out checking the fence alone, I feel eyes on me from the dark, and I hear that humming floating just beyond the lantern's reach. This was nothing compared to the next tale. Some folks say it'll give you chills. Last winter, up along the Gunflint Trail near the Canadian border, the snow fell so heavy it piled chest-high against the cabin walls, and the silence was thick enough to hear your own heartbeat echo back. My name's Hank, 59, retired forestry worker, and I've spent more nights out in the Boundary Waters than most folks spend in their beds. Since retiring, I've taken to trapping rabbits and marten for extra money, and the woods have become my second home, both comfort and curse. I've seen wolves slip through the timber without a sound, and heard moose crashing through ice-caked willows like wrecking balls, but nothing's ever rattled me quite like that night. I'd set out on my snowmobile just past 10, wanting to check some traps before the next storm rolled in. The northern lights shimmered overhead like green fire, and the cold was sharp enough to cut right through my layers. It felt like any ordinary night, until it didn't. About 4 miles in, I shut off the engine to listen for the soft ping of my trap alarms. That's when I noticed how dead quiet the forest had become. No wind rustling the birch branches, no owl calls, nothing. I stood there with my breath freezing around my beard, ears straining, and then I caught it, a low chattering sound, like teeth clicking together, coming from deep in the spruce. At first I thought it was a pine marten, but this sounded bigger. The clicks spaced out like someone knocking bones together. My chest tightened, and I thumbed my headlamp on, sweeping the snow in wide arcs. Shadows jumped and twisted over the drifts, and for a split second, I thought I saw a hunched figure dart behind a tree. My pulse skittered, my gloves suddenly too tight on my hands. The scent of cold, wet fur drifted past me, mingling with a strange metallic tang that made me swallow hard. My boots squeaked in the snow as I took a cautious step forward. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a lynx or a wolverine, acting odd. But the chattering grew louder, closer, and I realized it wasn't coming from one spot anymore. It seemed to circle me, echoing from tree to tree. The forest pressed in close, trunks crowded together like silent witnesses. A wave of nausea rolled through me as I felt the weight of unseen eyes. That's when I saw it, a shape emerging from behind a cluster of young spruces, moving low at first, then rising higher until it stood upright, towering at least 7 feet. The headlamp glared off fur that seemed half white, half gray, with shoulders broad as a man's and arms hanging long at its sides. Its eyes flashed a dull, greenish glow. For a moment, it stared at me, the chattering sound issuing from its mouth, as if it were trying to speak. I couldn't breathe. My body screamed to run, but I was rooted to the snow. Then the creature dropped back to all fours, and the headlamp beam finally caught the truth. It was a huge timber wolf, the biggest I've ever laid eyes on, its winter coat thick and pale enough to blend into the snowdrifts. Relief and dread tangled in my chest all at once. The wolf snarled low, showing long yellow fangs, but instead of attacking, it turned and loped into the shadows, leaving me shaking in my boots. I exhaled a shaky breath, trying to convince myself I'd only seen a normal wolf. But as I stepped forward to follow its tracks, my light shone on prints, twice as large as any wolf's, with strange drag marks between them, like clawed fingers pulling through the snow. The metallic scent hung in the air, making me gag. I stood there a long minute, lantern trembling in my hand, listening for the chattering that had vanished as quickly as it began. I know plenty of men who'd call me crazy, but I've seen enough winters to trust my own senses. Wolves don't walk upright, and they don't make noises like bones rattling in a wooden box. Sometimes, when the wind dies down and the auroras ripple overhead, I hear that faint chattering again and wonder if I really saw just a wolf or something wearing the forest as a disguise. Anyway, let's go to the next one. My name's Ellie. I'm 50, and I've been the mail carrier for the mall routes outside of Baudette, Minnesota, for over 20 years, driving the same gravel roads past frozen fields and jack pine thickets. Folks think delivering mail's dull, but in winter out here, it's anything but, especially when you're the only vehicle for miles. My husband jokes that I talk to deer more than people, and he's not entirely wrong. I like the quiet, though sometimes it plays tricks on your mind. One early December morning, before sunrise, I was running late and had to load the truck in darkness. The sky was a bruised shade of purple, and the air smelled like ice and distant wood smoke. The forecast said we'd get another foot of snow, and the cold was biting enough to make my eyes water. I swung onto County Road 30, radio low, headlights slicing through the swirling flurries. I'd driven that route so many times I could almost do it blind. But that morning, something waited on the roadside that's kept me from ever calling this job boring again. About 3 miles past Miller's old farm, I rounded a curve and caught sight of a figure crouched right at the ditch's edge. My headlights swept over it for barely a second, but I could see a shape hunched low, fur bristling, pale as frost. I hit the brakes, skidding slightly, heart banging so loud I felt it in my ears. For an instant I thought it was a coyote scavenging roadkill, but it was too big, with shoulders rolling under its coat in a way that looked wrong. It had a long snout, but the eyes seemed set forward like a human's. Steam puffed from its mouth in thick clouds as it lifted its head toward me. The snow hissed against my windshield, the wipers smearing thin ice across the glass. I sat there, gripping the wheel, not daring to blink, feeling the truck idling beneath me like a trembling animal. The figure slowly rose taller, and I felt my stomach drop. It took a few steps into the glow of my high beams, revealing legs that bent in a strange, double-jointed way. The fur along its spine spiked as if charged with static. My first thought was that it looked like a wolf, but stretched somehow, as if someone had pulled it taller and longer than nature intended. My breath fogged the cab as I whispered, "Oh God," under my breath. It tilted its head, eyes glowing an eerie yellow, and gave this low, rasping bark that vibrated through my chest like the bass from a church organ. I'd seen plenty of wolves and coyotes out here, but nothing that looked like this. My hands were shaking so badly I accidentally hit the horn, which blared into the silent trees. The creature flinched and crouched low again, hackles rising, teeth glinting pale in my headlights. My thoughts were running wild, half convinced I was staring at some creature out of old lumberjack legends. Suddenly it lunged across the road in one smooth bound, vanishing into the woods on the other side. I sat there, stunned, engine sputtering, waiting to see if it would come back out. When it didn't, I forced myself to edge forward. My headlights caught prints crossing the snow, huge paw marks, but spaced like a biped stride, not a four-legged trot. Each print was deep, and in the middle of some, I swear I saw marks like long fingers had dragged through the snow. The air smelled sharp and musky, like wet fur mixed with rusted metal. I thought about getting out to look closer, but couldn't make myself do it. Instead, I gunned the truck forward, heart still pounding, glancing in my mirror as if expecting to see yellow eyes staring back. I've told myself 100 times it was a sick wolf, maybe with mange, moving oddly because of pain. But nothing explains the way it stood up, or the shape of those tracks. Now, whenever I hit that curve on my route, I keep my foot on the gas and my eyes on the road. And this is just the beginning. What comes next still keeps me awake at night. My name's Pete. I'm 44, and I work as a fishing guide up near Lake Vermilion, Minnesota, which means I spend half my life on the water and the other half stomping through woods that can swallow a man whole. Folks always think the dangers out here are weather or bears, but it's the quiet that gets you sometimes. The way it presses in until you swear you hear things breathing between the trees. I've lived alone ever since my folks passed, running my small guide business and fixing up my old cabin when I'm not on the lake. One evening last April, I decided to check the shoreline ice before the spring melt, just as twilight began sliding into night. The sky was a faded navy, and the ice groaned like an old door under my boots. I had my headlamp on, casting pale light over the snow-crusted rocks. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but that night still hasn't let me go. About 20 yards from shore, I heard something crashing through the reeds, big enough to snap thick stalks like toothpicks. My first thought was moose, since they'll wade into the shallows even with ice still clinging to the edges. I stood still, heart thudding, awaiting for the shape to emerge. Instead, I heard a low, rhythmic clacking, like wood blocks knocked together in a strange pattern. I swept my headlamp across the cattails, but saw nothing but rippling shadows. The noise seemed to move around me in a half circle, never quite coming closer or farther. A bitter, gamey scent drifted across the ice, sharp enough to make my eyes water. The hairs on my arms lifted under my jacket, and my breath felt caught halfway to my lungs. I tried to call out, just to break the tension, but my voice came out in a choked whisper. I'd spent my whole life in these woods and never heard anything like that. A few seconds later, something stepped out onto the ice about 30 feet to my left. At first, all I saw were long legs and dark fur, silhouetted against the pale snow. My brain screamed wolf, but it moved strangely, its limbs too slender and its shoulders too high. It held its head low, eyes catching my light and flashing a deep orange glow. For a moment it just stood there, steam billowing from its nostrils in slow, measured breaths. Then it rose up on its hind legs, towering nearly 7 feet tall, its forelimbs hanging oddly like arms. I felt my knees buckle and had to plant my ice cleats to keep from dropping straight through the thinning crust. The creature tilted its head one way, then the other, as if trying to puzzle out what I was. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. My whole body felt frozen, as if the cold itself had locked me in place. The clacking sound started again, louder this time, echoing off the ice. Then, just as fast as it appeared, it dropped back down and bounded toward shore in 2 graceful leaps, vanishing into the trees without a single snap of twigs. I stood gasping in the dark, my headlamp trembling in my hands. I forced myself to shuffle over to where it had been, expecting normal wolf tracks. Instead, I found prints bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen, shaped like paws but longer, with deep gouges in the ice as though claws or fingers had raked the surface. I bent down to touch one, feeling the cold bite into my fingertips. The gamey odor still hung thick in the air, and my heart was beating so hard it felt like it might burst. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see glowing orange eyes peering out from the cattails. My pulse finally eased enough to get me moving again, and I stumbled back to shore without daring to look behind me. I keep telling myself it was a wolf with some injury, maybe standing on its hind legs out of confusion or pain, but the shape of those tracks and that strange clacking sound haunt me still. Every time I'm out on the lake alone at dusk, I find myself listening for it under the wind. Anyway, let's go to the next one. People say the forests around Kabetogama Lake hold secrets older than the oldest pines, and I guess after what happened, I'd be the last to argue. My name's Sam, 56, and I've been a park maintenance worker in Voyageurs National Park for near on 20 years. It's mostly quiet work, clearing fallen trees, checking campsites, patching up docks battered by ice. I live alone in a little cabin near the park entrance, and though I've seen my share of bears and wolves, I've always felt at home in these woods. One chilly March evening, I was hauling fuel cans to a storage shed about a mile down a service road. The sun had just set, leaving the snow glowing with a faint blue light, and the trees were dark silhouettes under a sky streaked with purple. My breath curled around my face in ghostly coils, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots. I wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble found me all the same. Halfway to the shed, I heard a noise like ice cracking, sharp and sudden, but somehow also wet, like bones snapping under meat. I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears. The sound came again, from somewhere deeper in the black spruce. It was rhythmic, too precise for a tree settling in the cold, almost like someone or something was moving with careful intent. A chill crawled up my spine, and I felt sweat prickle under my coat despite the freezing air. I shifted my grip on the fuel cans, telling myself it was just a deer spooked by my approach. But then the smell hit me, rank and sharp, like wet fur and rusted iron. I gagged, nearly dropping the cans. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might rattle my teeth loose. The shadows between the trees seemed to breathe in and out, swelling and shrinking as if alive. Then I saw it. A shape moved out from behind a cluster of pines, low at first, shoulders hunched, its fur shaggy and dark as burnt wood. I froze, eyes locked on it, trying to force my brain to fit it into something I recognized. As it stepped closer, moonlight slid across its back, revealing a creature taller than any timber wolf I'd ever seen, with a long snout and eyes that reflected pale gold like twin lanterns. It moved on all fours, but its front legs were longer than its back, giving it an odd, sloping posture. My breath hitched, my chest squeezing tighter with every step it took toward me. For one terrifying instant, it lifted itself up, standing almost man-height, and let out a low, groaning moan that seemed to vibrate through the snow itself. My legs threatened to give out beneath me. I'd heard tales of strange creatures from old Ojibwe stories, but never thought I'd see something that could make me believe them. I managed to whisper, "Get," as loud as my dry throat would allow. The creature stared at me for a long second, head tilted, eyes glinting. Then it dropped back down and turned away, slipping into the trees without a sound. The smell lingered long after it was gone, hanging in the cold air like a warning. I put the cans down and stepped closer to where it had stood, shining my flashlight over the snow. The tracks it left behind were huge, bigger than a wolf's, with long toe marks that ended in grooves, like something dragging claws or fingers. Some prints were spaced like a two-legged stride, others in a four-footed pattern, as though the thing couldn't decide how it wanted to move. My stomach twisted as I stared at them, knowing I'd never be able to explain this away to anyone who hadn't seen it. I keep telling myself it was a big wolf with some injury making it move funny. But even as I sit here now, I can still hear that groaning echo rolling through the spruce. I haven't walked that service road alone since, The next one will send chills down your spine. My name's Rachel. I'm 46, and I run a little bed and breakfast just outside of Orr, Minnesota, where the forest presses up so close against the buildings it feels like you're living inside a pine-scented cathedral. I've always loved the hush of the woods, the way the wind makes the branches sing different songs depending on the season. Since my husband passed 3 winters ago, it's been just me and my old hound dog, Copper, trying to keep the business afloat through long, quiet stretches of off-season. It was one of those off-season nights last November when this happened. A guest had left the porch light on, and I stepped out to switch it off around 11, the sky so black it felt bottomless. The stars were glittering like frost on glass, and the air was sharp enough to sting my nostrils. I wasn't expecting anything but the usual rustles of raccoons or the flap of an owl's wings. What I got was something that still has me second-guessing every shadow I see. As I reached the edge of the porch, I heard this deep, rhythmic grunting coming from the tree line, like someone slowly exhaling through a throat thick with phlegm. I froze, my hand hovering over the light switch. Copper perked his ears and gave a low, uncertain growl, the fur along his spine standing like a saw blade. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear, maybe rooting for the last scraps of fall berries, but the sound was too deliberate. Each grunt spaced like words in a sentence. I strained my eyes into the dark and thought I glimpsed a shape moving back and forth behind a stand of tamarack, shifting the branches as it passed. The smell drifted in next, a harsh, musky odor, almost like wet leather mixed with the tang of blood. My stomach flipped, and the air felt suddenly thick, pressing down on me. I swallowed hard, gripping the porch railing until my knuckles turned white. Then it stepped into the spill of porch light, and I felt my heart seize up. It was enormous, bigger than any bear I've ever seen, but built lower to the ground, with a hulking, sloped back and a long snout that ended in a wide, wet nose. Its fur was dark, matted, and glistened as though it had just climbed out of a river. Its eyes flashed a deep red under the porch light, and for a moment they seemed to lock onto mine in a way that felt disturbingly intelligent. It opened its mouth slightly, revealing teeth that looked too narrow and too many for a bear's jaw. Copper let out a sharp bark, but the creature barely flinched, only cocked its head like it was trying to decide what to do with us. My legs were shaking so bad I felt the wood boards vibrating under my boots. I tried to tell myself it was just a sick bear, but my mind kept screaming that no bear looked or stared like that. I whispered Copper's name and started backing slowly toward the door. Just as I reached for the knob, the creature dropped to all fours and lunged back into the darkness, moving faster than I'd ever seen anything that size move. The brush snapped and shivered in its wake, then fell silent again as if nothing had ever been there. I waited a long minute, listening, but all I heard was the distant hiss of wind through pine needles. I finally stepped off the porch to look for tracks, Copper glued to my side. In the soft earth beneath the tamaracks, I found prints the size of dinner plates, but instead of claw marks, there were shallow grooves, almost like the tips of fingers had dragged through the dirt. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt suddenly cold all over. The air smelled of that same wet leather and coppery tang, lingering as if the creature was still watching. Now I know bears can look strange in the dark, especially sick ones, and shadows play tricks on tired eyes. But those eyes, and those tracks, make me wonder what else walks the edges of these woods when we're not looking. Sometimes, when I stand on my porch at night, I feel like it might be there again, just out of sight, waiting for me to step into the dark. Anyway, let's go to the next one. They say up here in northern Minnesota, the loons cry to warn you when something unnatural's moving through the trees. My name's Doug, 58, and I've been a logger most my life, swinging chainsaws and hauling timber out of these forests since I was 16. I've seen my fair share of things. A black bear bluffed charging my crew, wolves slinking by silent as shadows, but nothing ever rattled me like what happened last May. The snow had mostly melted off the forest floor, leaving patches of brown needles and black mud, and we were cutting near Ash River Trail, way off where tourists don't bother to go. That day ran longer than planned, and by the time I'd fueled the skidder and packed up my gear, the sun was gone, leaving the woods steeped in a cool, bluish gloom. I decided to take the long way back to the truck, following a game trail that shaved off a half-mile. I figured I'd done it 100 times before. I was wrong. About 100 yards in, I started hearing a strange rustling, soft but steady, following me at a distance I couldn't quite pin down. I stopped and listened, but it stopped too. When I moved again, it picked up, like footsteps in perfect rhythm with mine. At first, I chalked it up to a deer or a curious fox trailing my scent. But then I caught a low, pulsing hiss, almost like steam venting from a pipe. It rose and fell in a steady cadence, making the hair lift on my forearms. The pines seemed to press in closer, their trunks black against the dimming sky. I smelled something sharp and mineral, like wet stones and old blood. My boots sucked at the mud with each step, and my breath felt too loud in the hush. I gripped the handle of my saw tighter, half expecting a cougar to leap out at me. But deep down, something told me this wasn't a cougar, or a bear, or anything else I could name. I came into a clearing, bathed in a sliver of moonlight, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the far edge, half hidden behind a jack pine, was something tall and gaunt, covered in dark mottled fur. Its shoulders were hunched, and its arms hung nearly to its knees, fingers or claws twitching as it shifted its weight. My chest locked up, like someone had strapped a band of steel around it. For a split second, I thought it was a man in a ghillie suit, but its legs were shaped all wrong, bending backward like a dog's. Its eyes reflected pale silver, and the hiss grew louder, rolling through the clearing like the rush of water over rocks. My mind flashed to old lumber camp tales of creatures that walked the woods, stealing voices and leading men off trails. I wanted to yell, to run, but I felt like my feet were rooted into the mud. The shadows seemed to ripple outward from where it stood, darkening the edges of my vision. I raised my saw, ready to crank it to life, thinking the roar might scare it off. But before I could pull the cord, the thing dropped onto all fours and darted into the trees so fast the brush barely moved. Silence fell so heavy it felt like I'd gone deaf. I staggered forward, scanning the clearing with my flashlight. On the muddy ground were prints big as my open hand, shaped like paws, but with 5 long digits at the front, each ending in a sharp drag mark. I crouched to touch one, but the moment my glove brushed the print, that metallic scent hit me like a slap. The hiss came again, faint this time, drifting through the trees as if whatever it was circled me unseen. I stood there, shaking, my breath clouding the beam of my light, trying to convince myself it was just a sick bear. But bears don't hiss like that, and they sure as hell don't stand upright for as long as that thing did. Now some of the boys at the camp laugh when I tell it, saying I'd been breathing too much two-stroke exhaust. But I've worked these woods too long to mistake an animal for something else. I still avoid that trail after dark, and sometimes, when the loons cry out all at once, I wonder if it's warning me it's still there, waiting. Thanks for sticking around and listening to all these tales. If you enjoyed these stories, please hit that subscribe button and give the video a like. It really helps the channel keep growing. Stay safe out there and keep your eyes on the shadows.